All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our Office Hours webinar for BrainHQ today. We are so glad that you could be here joining us. My name is Stephanie and I am a multimedia specialist within the customer support team here. My co-host today is Dr. Henry Mahncke, whom most of you have seen in our previous webinars. But for those who need to be reacquainted with him, Henry earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California, San Francisco, where he studied brain plasticity with our co-founder, Dr. Michael Mahncke. He has been running the show as our CEO of Posit Science since 2011. Today, Henry is going to be given a presentation about brain health research and sort of the research that goes into the exercises behind BrainHQ. So Henry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Nice to see you, Stephanie.
Good to see you too. So this, as an office hours webinar, you are able to ask questions throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel and ask your questions. Henry and I will go ahead and answer them, as many of them as we can throughout the course of the webinar. If your question doesn't get answered today, that's okay. You can always send questions to support@brainhq.com, and those questions will reach me and my customer support team. And any of those questions that we aren't able to answer, we can also then find somebody who can answer them for you. We also have a support site, which you can find at support.brainhq.com, that has answers to a lot of common questions about BrainHQ in general. The last thing that I wanted to note before we get started is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel sometime next week. If you want a notification when that video goes live, you can head on over to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe there. If you subscribe, you should receive an email notification when the video goes live sometime next week. If you don't want to subscribe, that's also okay. I'm going to send everybody who registered for the webinar a follow-up email next week with a link to the video as well.
Fantastic.
All right. So I think without further ado, Henry, I'm going to go ahead and toss it off to you. Go ahead and take the screen share whenever you're ready.
Okay, let me give that a try here. Well, what Stephanie and I wanted to talk with you about today is the question of, hey, how do we invent these brain training exercises anyway? And then how do we show that they work? And in particular, we wanted to talk about this in this office hours because we often get questions about, hey, why does this exercise look the way it looks? Why does it sound the way it sounds? Why is it hard in some very specific ways? And we wanted to pull back the curtain and give you some insight into the minds of the scientists and the designers who build these exercises. I'm going to show a few slides here at the beginning, probably about 15 or 20 minutes to orient you to this. And then what we hope is based on that you can ask us questions really about any exercise in BrainHQ and the science behind it and why it works the way it does. And we'll talk you through that based on some of the principles that we established right off the bat. So with that in mind, let's start here. You know, I'm actually going to start at a different place than brain training exercises. I'm going to start in the world of molecules that affect brain function and behavior. And everyone here has probably heard of all kinds of different drugs that pharmaceutical companies have that affect brain function and behavior. And, you know, it turns out that it's pretty hard to build those kinds of drugs. What we're looking at here is two different molecular images. This is of one drug, and this is of another drug. Each of these little balls that you see is a single atom in this drug. And these little lines that connect them are, well, the bonds that connect them. And if you are not a pharmaceutical chemist, as I am not, then you might look at these and say, well, they're kind of different, but I really couldn't tell you what the difference is, and I really couldn't tell you what makes one different than the other. But it turns out they are really quite different. The drug on the left here is aripiprazole. This is actually a drug that helps with severe mental illness like schizophrenia. And the drug on the right here is erythromycin. This is a drug that helps with bacterial infections. And the point is that these drugs have been designed, tested, and engineered to be very, very different, even though they look to a novice like they're kind of similar. And in the way that they are very, very different, they have incredibly different effects on the body. And understanding and validating the difference between these molecular structure, well, it takes people with decades of experience in complicated fields like biochemistry and pharmacology and drug design. And then it typically takes 10 or more years of clinical trials to show what the positive effects and perhaps what the risks are of each one. So what I want to let you know is building brain training exercises has actually got some similarities to that. You know, if you were to look at these two different things you could do on your phone or your computer, on the left here is the double decision exercise, which many of you probably know is a popular and a wonderful exercise in BrainHQ that has a lot of benefits. On the right here is the game Candy Crush, which is a very fun game to play if you've got some time to kill in line or you're on the subway, but has no particular brain health or cognitive benefits as far as we know. And if you didn't necessarily know a lot about the kinds of science that it takes to build an effective brain training exercise, you might look at these both and say, well, maybe they're a bit the same. But what I'm going to talk you through today is that understanding and validating the difference in these two different activities you can do on a computer or a phone, well, it also takes people with decades of experience, now in fields like neurology and psychophysics and brain plasticity, and then it can take 10 years of clinical trial to show that one of them has all the positive effects that it does. And so let me talk you through that process a little bit. How do we go about coming up with the specific aspects of a brain training exercise in BrainHQ that make it work? Well, I come out of a lab at the University of California, San Francisco that was led by Dr. Michael Mahncke, the Chief Science Officer and co-founder here at BrainHQ. And some of you have been following our work for a while, and you probably know that Dr. Mahncke is renowned across the world in the field of neuroscience for discovering the idea that the adult brain is plastic, for discovering the principles of brain plasticity. And what I mean by that is what he figured out in his research, and then his students like me and his collaborators from all over the world, is that the adult brain is not hardwired like a computer chip, but actually the adult brain is plastic and capable of being changed. And what it means is if we understand the right experiences and the right training to give the brain, we can rewire the brain in all kinds of helpful and productive ways. But there's a right way to rewire the brain so the brain gets healthier and stronger. And these are the 5 principles that Mike Mahncke figured out in his lab and that we've put to work at BrainHQ. So if you want to build a brain training exercise that works on the ideas of brain plasticity and rewires the brain in a helpful way, here are the 5 things that an exercise has to do. First of all, the exercise has to work on speed. The exercise has to make your brain faster, because one of the core issues in any brain is, hey, faster brains are healthier and work better. And so the exercise should employ increasingly brief stimuli and increasingly rapid sequences to make the brain get faster. And if you've done some BrainHQ training, you've probably seen a lot of exercises that get faster and make your brain work harder on speed. So making the brain faster is a key part of rewiring and changing it. But equivalently, we need to make the brain more accurate. There's no point in getting faster if you're just going to make more mistakes because you're going faster. So if we want to build effective exercises, they have to train speed, but they have to train accuracy at the same time. And the way we do that in our exercises is we employ increasingly challenging discriminations. What I mean by that is the things you see and the things you hear, they get harder and harder to tell apart to make sure we're pushing your brain on accuracy as well. The third thing that an effective brain plasticity-based training exercise has to do is to be adaptive. If you are doing a brain training exercise and it's always too hard, well, your brain actually can't rewire itself. It's almost like you're trying to climb a mountain and you can't quite get a hold to even start climbing the mountain. So it can't be too hard, but it also can't be too easy. If you're doing a brain training exercise and you always get it right, well, then your brain actually doesn't need to rewire itself. Your brain's already perfectly adequate at doing it. So to make an effective brain training exercise, the exercise has to constantly change its difficulty. It has to get harder as you get better at it, but it also has to get easier if you're having an off day or need a moment to catch up. So we call that making the brain training exercise adaptive. And in BrainHQ, we try to make the exercises so that people get between 70 to 90% of the trials right. That's enough to that's enough success to help rewire the brain, but it's enough times getting it wrong that the brain needs to know that it has to get rewired. The fourth big thing we have to do in these exercises is we have to pick exercises and stimuli, things that you see and things that you hear, that generalize to real-world behaviors. Now, I don't know if some of you have played a lot of video games. I've played a lot of video games. My kids have played a lot of video games, but one common issue about video games is, hey, you get better at playing the game, right? But you don't necessarily get better at regular cognitive functions like speed and attention and memory. And a great example is Wordle, if you play that New York Times word puzzle game. My wife and I both play it. We like to compare our strategies at the end of the day. But when you play Wordle, you just kind of get better at Wordle. It doesn't have any evidence that it improves your other cognitive functions like speed or attention or memory, or there's not even evidence that it improves your sort of ordinary use of words. The way most people get better at Wordle, and I know this is how I got better at Wordle, is you get better strategies and you think of better 5-letter words that fit the puzzle. And again, that's great for solving Wordle, but it probably doesn't help you in your real-world use of your brain health or your brain function or your cognitive abilities. When we're building brain training exercises in BrainHQ, what we do is we want to use stimuli that relate to real world things. So we want to have auditory stimuli that you hear that relate to human speech and language, because we want your brain to be better at processing language when you hear things in the real world. When we build visual stimuli in the visual exercises, we want them to eventually resemble things that are, have the characteristics of the things that you might encounter out in the real world, so that when your brain gets better on the exercises, your brain also gets better at navigating in the real world. I'll give you some concrete examples of that in just a moment. And finally, when we build these brain training exercises, the fifth principle is engagement. And what we mean by that is we want the brain to turn on these key neurochemical systems, these key neuromodulatory systems that help drive brain plasticity. When your brain pays attention, it releases a neurochemical called acetylcholine that actually lets the brain rewire itself. When you get rewarded for getting something right, your brain pumps out a little bit of dopamine that helps rewire the brain and says, hey, however you just did it, do it that way again. That one worked. When you see something new or surprising, your brain actually activates these novelty systems and releases noradrenaline, and that actually helps the brain get rewired as well. So that means the exercises have to be fun and engaging, but they're more than fun and engaging. They're designed to release these neurochemicals that actually promote brain plasticity. So every exercise in BrainHQ works on a mix of these 5 principles. And let me walk you through a couple of examples to make it concrete about what I mean. I'm going to first talk about visual exercises in BrainHQ, and then I'll talk about auditory exercises, and then I'm going to go into an example of an exercise in particular. So in particular, when we think about building the visual exercises in BrainHQ, exercises like Hawkeye or Double Decision or Target Tracker, or my favorite, Eye for Detail, one big thing that we want to do is we want to strengthen the brain's visual information processing by moving from what we call emphasized visual scenes to cluttered visual scenes. And what I mean is this. Let's take an example from Target Tracker, where you're tracking multiple things moving around the screen, right? Now, this is an exercise that trains attention and sustained attention and divided attention. But the first time you do this exercise, it starts off with these big bright bubbles on this pretty dark background. And we call this an emphasized visual screen. And what I mean is that the things we need to track, the bubbles, they really pop out with that bright blue against that dark black. They deliver strong stimulation to the visual system. And we start that way because that strong stimulation to the visual system, well, it helps kick off brain plasticity. It helps the brain start to rewire itself. But then as you go through Target Tracker, you're eventually going to see levels like this. Now here we see these puffer fish, and they're still pretty clear against the background, but you can see that the background is more complex. The fish themselves have more texture to them. It actually is more work for the brain now to track these fish against this cluttered background. So we're making it a little bit less easy, we're making it harder, but we're also making it a little bit more natural. I know you don't live underwater in an aquarium, I don't either, but we are making the things that you see a little bit more mixed into the background, which makes them a little bit more like what you might encounter in the real world as you're driving or walking. And when you get to the hardest levels of Target Tracker, you see these faint pink jellyfish against this bright blue background. And it's hard work to see these. People email us all the time and say, wow, this is really hard. I'm not doing as well. But that's okay. We want to make this harder so that your brain is really pushing itself to do this demanding attention task, so that when you're out in the real world, your brain is ready to push itself to track demanding multiple objects. For example, while you're driving and you have a lot of cars around you, or when you're out, for example, with young people who are running around the playground, in those demanding visual environments, we want your attention system to already be working really well. Now, we do a very similar thing in the auditory system, and I want to play you some examples because we get a lot of question about this as well. How do we take this idea of starting off with a really emphasized visual scene and moving to a cluttered scene? How do we do that in the auditory system? Well, what we do in the auditory system, and this is relevant to exercises like memory grid or listen and do, is we actually take human speech and we stretch it out at first. So here's a sort of odd little word, cax. But let me play how we start it. And what our scientists have done is they stretched this out and emphasized it. So it's going to sound a little funny.
Cax.
Stephanie, could you hear that okay? I hope you could.
Yep, came through just fine.
Perfect. So that doesn't sound exactly like cax the way I say cax. Let's play it again. It's stretched out and it's emphasized.
Cax.
Now we do that because by stretching that out and making that ka sound really long and kind of loud, again, we're hitting the auditory system, the language systems of the brain with that big, strong stimulus, and that helps kick off the rewiring process. But we don't really want you to stay on those sounds forever. We want you to start training on more normal sounds. So here's cax at more of a normal speed.
Cax.
Now that's a little bit more the way you might hear it in normal conversation. And when you get to hardest levels in these exercises, we're actually going to speed it up.
Cax. Cax.
So we're moving from stretched out and slow to normal to speed it up. And we're doing that because we want to give you a language processing system in your brain that can hear really well and really accurately, even when people are speaking quickly, when they're speaking in noisy environments like the restaurant or on a phone. We want your brain to be trained for that so that you can hear what people say, you can store it in your memory, you can act on it, and generally just have that vibrant life that comes from talking to the people around you, whether they're strangers or friends or family members. So with those ideas in mind, I'm now going to talk about one exercise in particular and talk about how we apply these principles. And what I want to talk about is the Hawkeye exercise. So way back when, we didn't have a Hawkeye exercise, but we had with scientists who knew that we wanted to train visual function, and then in particular, we wanted to train visual speed and peripheral attention. And so why do we pick that? Why did our scientists care about that? Well, we knew that visual speed and peripheral attention are really important for activities like driving. If you're driving a car, you're typically looking ahead of you, but if a ball rolls in off the side of a street, for example, if your visual speed and attention is not working very well in your peripheral vision, you might not notice that ball and you might just keep driving, and that's a dangerous situation because if a ball rolls out on the street, a kid's probably going to chase it right after that. But if you have a fast, accurate peripheral vision, then hey, when that ball rolls out on the street, you're going to notice it quickly and you're going to do what you know you should do, right? Slow the car down or maybe even stop it because we want to keep ourselves and the people around us safe. So we knew this was an important cognitive function. So we read a lot of scientific papers about visual speed and attention. We talked with a lot of academic researchers who made it their life's work to study how the brain processes visual information and how the brain handles quick stimuli and how it handles attention. And we talked with clinicians who studied all kinds of brain health conditions who could tell us, hey, what is it like when a person starts to experience these problems in peripheral speed and attention? So we start off by making sure we understand the behavior and the neurology and the brain science really well. And then our science team develops 2 or 3 exercise concepts. And after playing around with them and sharing them with people a little bit, we picked one candidate concept for further development. And that's the exercise that you now know as Hawkeye, where you're going to be looking at the screen and seeing these birds appear in your peripheral vision. And they're going to appear very quickly. And you need to notice which of the birds is different, which in this case, this bird is around the 3 o'clock position. So once we have a candidate, what we do is we then want to ask the question, well, can we make this adaptive? You might remember we said that making the exercise harder or easier is a key part of making a brain plasticity-based training exercise. And it turns out you can make the Hawkeye exercise adaptive pretty easily by manipulating how long are the birds on the screen for. If the birds are on the screen for a very long period of time, which on this graph would be over here on the right side, well, then people get 100% of it right? If it's up there for 3 or 4 seconds, you can just look around until you find the bird that's different. But you can make it regularly more difficult by making it faster and faster. So as we move left on this, the birds are on the screen for a shorter period of time, and you can see there's eventually a time where I'm kind of guessing, right? I'm only getting about 50% of them right, and if we make it fast enough, a person's not going to get any of them right. And that is perfect from a science perspective, because what it means is that no matter where your brain is on this curve, we can make the birds on the screen for a longer or shorter time, so it's challenging for you and your unique brain. Okay, so we've made it adaptive. What do we do next? Well, what we do next is we build out these stimuli in exactly the way I talked about with Target Tracker. You can see in these example screenshots from Hawkeye that when it starts, these birds are pretty easy to see on this background. They're bright red, they got these black wings, it's this dark blue screen. Your brain can easily see the birds, and you can really focus on the hard part, which is knowing where the different bird is. And in case you're wondering where the different bird is, it's actually hidden right here. But then as you go through Hawkeye, we make those stimuli harder, just like we did in Target Tracker. Here we're now looking at these hawks. They're against this kind of foresty background. Our brain has to work harder to see the birds and notice which ones are different. And when you get to these very demanding levels of Hawkeye, they're quite hard. You can see kind of these hummingbirds, and they're almost impossible to see, at least on this screen. Sorry about that. But they're actually hidden against this foliage, so your brain has to work very, very hard to pop them out. But we want to have your brain working hard like that again, so that when you're out in the normal world and you're driving or walking or enjoying the world, your brain is already used to working hard like that, so that it's going to see things quickly and accurately in our peripheral vision. So after we design all this, well, we then go back and make sure, hey, did we get it right? So this was a wonderful partnership between our science team, led by a scientist here called Peter Delahunt, who spent his career working in vision science, and working with our art team, led at that point by Don Richards, who designed all of these beautiful birds that you see on the screen. And they worked very carefully then to test it. So they had an idea. So what we're looking at here is each of these bird pairs on the bottom is from a different level in Hawkeye. On the left, you might recognize the birds we start off with. And if you've done a lot of Hawkeye, you might have had to work with these two very similar blue birds, but they are slightly different. And what the science and the art team did together is they tested people who hadn't trained on BrainHQ, and they showed that, hey, these birds are pretty easy to tell apart. People are pretty fast at it. It only takes them maybe 40 milliseconds to tell the difference. But these birds that we wanted to be harder to tell apart, well, they're much harder to tell apart. They have to be on the screen for much longer for us to tell the difference between them. So that helped convince us, hey, we had gotten kind of the art and the science right here. We could make this exercise systematically harder in the way we wanted to. So what we then wanted to do next was to say, well, is this the kind of the task that actually matters? Is it true, for example, that in aging, that people are not as good at this as they were when they were younger? And so we actually took this out and we tested younger people and older people. And as you can see, the younger people on this task, they typically only need about 1/10 of a second, 100 milliseconds or so, to correctly find that bird on the screen. Whereas as people got older, on the average, they needed 3 or almost 4 times as much time to notice where that bird was in the peripheral vision. So that told us that, hey, something really is changing as we get older in our ability to do this peripheral vision task, this Hawkeye task. And that's great news, because if there's a difference here, what it means is, well, maybe if people train on Hawkeye, they would get better. So the final thing we did as we were building this exercise is we did exactly that. We had people come in and they trained for 10 hours on just the Hawkeye exercise, and we measured their performance. And you can see that when they started, well, it took about 400 milliseconds, almost half a second, to be able to correctly locate that target bird. But as they trained through all those levels, they got faster and faster, so these lower scores are better here. And you can see that after about 5 or 6 hours, they had gotten really good. In fact, they were just about as good as a young person who had never trained before. So that meant that by practicing at the task, they got much better. We were renormalizing brain function. We were renormalizing the speed and attention in the visual system. And we can see that over here as well. This is individual data where you can see that there's lots of variability, but on the average, people get better and better. And see it again here at the end, after 90 blocks of training, which is what we call a level in BrainHQ, again, about 10 hours, we see that people were almost 50% faster at the Hawkeye task. So that's fantastic. At that point, we usually can take this task and release it out into the world. And that's what we did when we launched Hawkeye back in the day. But of course, we're not done at that point, and I do want to sort of wrap this up by talking about one very important last step, which is, hey, as well as everything I just showed you that goes into the science of building an exercise, which unto itself can take years, we then want to go out and show that the exercise actually works in large-scale clinical trials. So this is a wonderful study that the NIH funded, run by my colleague here at Posit Science, Dr. Q Lee. And what she did is she worked with 124 older adults. Half of them were were recruited at a university in Texas and half in Iowa. So we made sure we had a lot of diversity in the people we worked with. And half of these older adults did BrainHQ with a mix of exercises, including Hawkeye, and half of them played ordinary video games that, like Candy Crush, like I showed you at the beginning of this talk. And what we saw is that the cognitive function improvements in the BrainHQ group were more than twice as big as the cognitive function improvements in the control in the video game group. And what that means is, well, by rewiring the brain, we've improved cognitive function, which is exactly what we set out to do. And this study went even further. It actually did magnetic resonance brain imaging. So what we're looking at here is images of the brain. And you can see these little splotches of color here, red and blue. Here's the brain sideways. Here's the brain from the front. Here's the brain from the top down. And what these areas of color indicate is areas where the scientists could see that the brain wiring had actually gotten stronger as a result of this training. And this is a pretty important part of brain wiring. It kind of connects the back half of the brain to the front half of the brain. So it's involved in sending sensory information, what we hear and what we see, all the way to the front of our brain where we can make decisions on it. So it confirmed that this BrainHQ training, including Hawkeye, really literally rewired the brain just the way we had designed it to. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that's been a helpful kickoff to our discussion of how do we make a brain training exercise that works. Hope that's given you some examples of course, the very detailed example of Hawkeye, but some broader thoughts about how we do this with visual and auditory training exercises. And with that, Stephanie, I think we will take some questions if we have some from our audience today. And again, happy to take questions about any BrainHQ exercise that you have been working with that maybe you've been wondering, why does it look the way it looks? Why does it sound the way it sounds? Why are some parts of it hard? Why are some parts of it easy? We would love to answer those questions. And we should be able to, I suppose, to demo specific exercises, Stephanie, if that would be helpful. So I'll stop there and let's see if we have some questions.
All right, that sounds good. We do have quite a few questions that have come in during your presentation, which, by the way, thank you. There was information about Hawkeye that I didn't even know after being here for more than 10 years. So that was fascinating. All right, so we do have a couple questions about specific exercises, but there is one at the top of the list here about scientific studies that I wanted to touch on.
Super.
Adelia is asking about double decision. She says, all of the studies that I've seen that use BrainHQ exercises for their studies seem to use double decision. Is that correct, and why? Is that considered to be the gold standard of BrainHQ exercises? And to even go further, could one achieve the goals of BrainHQ training by just training with double decision? So a lot of great questions there.
That is a great question. Double decision is an exercise that has a kind of a unique status in BrainHQ. And that's because the double decision exercise was originally invented, not here at BrainHQ, but by a wonderful set of vision scientists working in university labs, Dr. Carleen Ball and Dr. Dan Runker. They actually came up with the original idea way back when in 1989. And that means that they had some of this thinking before I even started graduate school. And Stephanie, I started graduate school a long time ago. And the history of that is they built out an original version of the double decision task in very simple form, like black and white. It ran on an old Microsoft PC DOS, if you remember that operating system for back in the day. But they ran some very nice clinical trials of that training exercise funded by the NIH. They showed that, for example, that your score on that exercise predicted your risk of having an auto crash in the future. because it was a good measure of how your visual system and attention were working. And they actually went on to get funded by the National Institutes of Health to run a very large study called the ACTIVE study. The ACTIVE study is one of the largest studies that have ever been done of brain training, and they used that original version of the double decision exercise, which was then called speed training. And because that ACTIVE study was such a significant study, there's probably been 25, 30, maybe more publications specifically from that study. Now, when we started building visual exercises, around the same time our science team was building the Hawkeye exercise I just showed you about, we actually reached out to Dr. Ball and Dr. Runker and said, hey, we seem like we're kind of doing the same thing. We're both interested in building visual training exercises. We've obviously both thought a lot about brain plasticity. But hey, you're mainly working in a university laboratory environment. Could we help take that exercise and make it broadly available to lots of people? And lucky for us, Carleen Ball and Dan Runker are just about the nicest people you're ever going to meet in the world. And so we started off a wonderful collaboration with them where we took that old DOS-based exercise and we rebuilt it in this more modern form. So it ran on the web and ran on a mobile phone, and we incorporated into the overall BrainHQ framework. Now, what that means is, as the questioner asked, as I am finally getting to, is, hey, that double decision exercise came with a lot of studies that were specifically attached to it. However, I do want to emphasize there have been quite a few studies of BrainHQ exercises that don't use double decision as well. So when we started BrainHQ, we first built auditory training exercises, as I mentioned, that were designed to help a person remember speech better and process speech better. And there's a lot of studies focusing on those auditory exercises that don't have double decision, that show that those BrainHQ exercises help a person remember things that they hear better. People are better at remembering lists. They're better at working memory. They also get better at, for example, at improving their ability to hear in a noisy place because the auditory system is sharper. So in that sense, hey, lots of other exercises in BrainHQ have lots of great validation data, but we're certainly very appreciative of how much data the double decision exercise came with us too. So wonderful question. Long answer. Hope that made sense, but a wonderful question. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to pick some more questions that deal with the science. Oh, here's one from Debbie that is actually a really common question that we get. For folks using BrainHQ, how long are brain changes shown to last in our research studies? What is the sort of longest time period that we have maybe looked at in our research?
That is a great question. Somewhat amazingly, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at a lot of follow-up periods. So for example, some of the earlier studies we did had people do BrainHQ exercises for, let's say, 2 or 3 months. And then we had people stop doing the exercises, and we measured cognition before they started, after they were done, and then after what we call a follow-up period where they weren't doing any more brain training. And what we saw was that, hey, actually the benefits, you could start to see them wear off. And in fact, the initial studies looked 3 months after training, and you could start to see them wearing off, but they were still quite evident after 3 months of training. And in fact, that ACTIVE study that I mentioned that the NIH funded, they actually followed people for 10 years. In that case, people did training for about 2 months in the first year, and then they did some booster training, just a little bit of extra training at the end of the first year, at the end of the third year. 7 more years, no more brain training. And you could clearly see that the benefits were wearing off, but you could also clearly see that the folks who had done the brain training were better off at the end of 10 years than the folks who hadn't done the brain training. Now, a couple thoughts on that. First of all, you have to look at that study and ask, well, how much better would the results have been if they just did some brain training, maybe twice a year for the next 10 years, right? I bet you could have maintained the full benefits of brain training over 10 years. But another question that anyone might ask is, well, how on earth could it last this long, right? I had lunch today, and if you asked me 10 years from now what I had for lunch on Wednesday, November 13th, I would not be able to tell you the answer to that question. So why is it that brain training can be so long lasting? And the answer to that is the kind of brain training we're doing with BrainHQ. It's really training your brain on a skill or a procedure. We're not teaching you facts, as you know. We're not teaching you that on, Wednesday, November 13, you had eggs for breakfast, and can you remember that 10 years later? This is more like learning to ride a bike, or learning a foreign language, or learning a musical instrument. And let me give you an example from my personal life. My daughter, we're in San Francisco, and when my daughter was 8 or 9 years old, it was time to learn to ride a bike. And maybe that's a little bit later than other kids, but San Francisco is a very hilly city, so it takes a little while to build up some strength. But we went out, and she had a little bike, and we took off her training wheels, and she learned to ride. And after about 10 hours, going a couple weekends over a month or two, hey, she could ride that bike, right? She could start it, she could stop it, she could go up a little hill, and so her brain had been rewired to become a bike riding brain. Now, that's not what we call declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is when I teach you facts, right? So I didn't tell her any facts about riding a bike because that's not how you learn to ride a bike. You have to do it, right? So then what happened is, hey, she rode it kind of on and off, but after high school, or in high school, she didn't ride that much. And now she's in college out near Boston, and she got a bike again. Now, she hadn't done much brain training for bike riding over that intervening 5 or 6 or 8 years. But when she got on that bike in Boston for the first time, she was able to ride it. Now, she wasn't quite as good as she had been, but she was much better than if she had never ridden her bike at all. So what does that tell us? That tells us that this kind of skill learning, like learning to ride a bike, like learning a foreign language, like learning a musical instrument, or like learning BrainHQ exercises. It rewires the brain in this very deep and fundamental way that can last for a very long time. Now, when we tell people about doing BrainHQ, I often tell them, hey, the good news is you do not have to do it every day for the rest of your life, right? If you're thinking about taking a medicine, you usually have to take that every day for the rest of your life because the medicine washes out of your body and then it doesn't help you anymore. Brain training is not quite like that. You can do it for a while and then you can take a break for a while. I do recommend that people come back to it because, it does wear off and we want to boost it back up. But you don't have to feel bad if you take a few days or a few weeks or even a few months off because those benefits will still be there in your brain. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and that partially also answers a question that we had from an anonymous attendee asking, how do you know that you're getting better? How do you know it's helping your memory training with BrainHQ, or if you're just getting better at the games? You had in
Uh,
your presentation talked about playing Wordle kind of just makes you better at Wordle. So talking about that
right.
generalization.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the way I take that question is, hey, in Brain HQ itself, of course, there's a lot of ways to track that you are getting better at the brain training exercises. And hey, the first step towards getting better in the real world is to get better at the exercises. If you don't get better at the exercises, probably not going to experience real world benefits. So there's a lot of metrics in BrainHQ, whether it's the BrainAQ measure or whether it's the progress graphs in the exercises or whether it's earning stars and achievements that show you, hey, I'm getting better at this as I go. And if I was going to draw an analogy to physical fitness, let's say you decided you wanted to start walking regularly to improve your heart health, right? At first, maybe you can walk around the block and it takes 15 minutes, and then you can walk around the block and it takes 12 minutes. You're a little faster, and then you can walk 2 blocks, and then you can walk half a mile. All of that tells you, hey, I'm getting better at walking. But it doesn't necessarily tell you you're getting better at heart health or endurance. You have to notice things in your life. If you begin an exercise program, you might notice, hey, I can go up the stairs, or I can keep up with my kids. Or, when I'm out for a walk in the park, I don't get tired. You notice those real world benefits. Brain HQ is the same way. Within the brain training exercises, you study your brain EQ and your performance graphs, and you see you're getting better. But then I encourage people to see what they notice in their real world lives. That's how you can see how it's helping you. And usually when we talk to people, people come back and they tell us, hey, I'm noticing more of the world faster. I'm driving and things don't seem to be coming out of nowhere anymore. I see them before they happen. I'm talking to people and I can hit on more of the details of what I hear. We actually had someone write us in recently who's an opera singer, and she talked about how the Brain HQ training and helped her hear more emotional depth in the music, and she was able to keep up with reading the music and singing the music better than she had before. So, by having that sharper, better brain, we have to look for the things that you care about in your life, but that's how you should be noticing how it's helping you out in your life and in the real world. Great question. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple of other questions that I have sort of picked out here. We had talked about sort of the different, like when talking about Hawkeye, we talked about how there was so much research putting into the different kinds of birds at different kinds of levels. Philip is asking about the step up and step down sort of progression in the exercises. In some exercises, you have to take a step back when you make a single mistake. Other exercises, You can make a couple of mistakes before it slows down. Can you maybe speak to that and
Yeah,
from a
yeah,
research
sure.
perspective, that algorithm?
Yep. So all those algorithms are designed mathematically to keep you around, let's say, 70 to 90% correct. But you're absolutely right. Different exercises do work differently. The simplest exercises are those exercises that are focused on speed, like Hawkeye. And in those, as you notice, hey, as soon as you get one wrong, it's going to move you down a level, and it'll move you up once you get two or three right. So first of all, why does it take more to go up than to go down? Well, the reason for that is, hey, we want to be sure you just didn't get lucky and you got it right, right? We need to see that you can do it at that speed twice before we're confident we can make it faster. But we'll move it down with only one because, hey, doing Hawkeye is pretty quick. And so if you get one wrong by bad luck, it's pretty quick to get back up to where the level you were. Right? But with other exercises, and target tracker is a good example, it kind of takes a while to do the target tracker exercise, right? All the bubbles and the fish got to move around. You got to sit there and wait for a while. And what that means is we didn't want to lower the difficulty instantly if a person just got a single one wrong, because it just takes too much time to get them back up to the level where it's challenging to their brain. So in that exercise, I believe you have to get two of them wrong because, okay, this is really probably too hard. We should make it easier. But we don't want to be sort of hasty about that. And then other exercises, and so for example, I suppose the continuous performance exercises like divided attention, where you're seeing, different colors and shapes and patterns kind of appear on the screen. They're moving very, very quickly. In those exercises, you have to keep up with them, right? They don't stop and ask you what the right answer is. You have to give the right answer instantly after you see the things on the screen. And so for those, we make it, you have to get a bunch right to go up, and frankly, you have to get a bunch right to go down, because we know that people can just kind of get off target for a minute and they might miss three or four, and we want to give them a chance to get back on target before we make it easier. So that's how the scientists have thought about those adaptive algorithms in each case. But in any case, we do want people to be doing these and getting well more than half of them right, so your brain gets the positive feedback it needs to get to learn. So, great question. I guess I want to say one more thing about that. If we go back to the examples that I was showing, for example, in Hawkeye, where it starts off with the birds on the blue screen, and then the birds are a little harder to see, and then the birds are very hard to see. Hey, you're going to have a lower absolute performance, right? You might do that early level, and it might get you down to, let's say, 50 milliseconds, very, very fast on the screen. And then you're doing that level where the birds are on that jungle, and you're like, I don't even see them at first. And then when you finally get a hang of it, maybe it takes you 300, 400 milliseconds, you're much, much slower. That's okay. In both of those levels, that adaptive algorithm we just talked about, by which it's getting harder, easier, it's making the exercise level go to a point where you're getting about 70 to 90% right. That number might be higher if the exercise is harder, but that's okay. You're still training your brain at threshold, right? You're still driving the right kind of changes in your brain to benefit your brain health.
Well said. Very, very thorough answer. Thank you, Henry. All right, we had a question from another anonymous attendee, wondering if there are going to be new exercises added to BrainHQ in the future, or if we're focusing maybe on updates to existing exercises. Given how long it takes for us to make an exercise and the research behind it, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. No, we're always interested in new exercises, and I will tell you about one or two things that we're sort of thinking about. But like you said, and like I talked about, it takes quite a while for us to develop an exercise. And there are a million brain game companies out there making brain games that don't have a lot of validation behind them, but we don't generally want to bring out exercises that haven't been thoroughly tested and shown to be helpful and beneficial. So it does take us longer. That being said, the kind of things that the science team is interested in here is, hey, we're interested in thinking about exercises around movement control, right? Could we build exercises where you have to, for example, tap with your fingers in various more fancy and complex ways? And could those kinds of exercises help improve the brain's ability to control movement in the hands or maybe even beyond? Right? Much of BrainHQ is about information that coming into your brain. Hey, could there be BrainHQ exercises about information that kind of goes out of your brain? And we're also really interested in modifications of the freeze frame exercise. If you do freeze frame, you know that what you have to do is you have to you see a target stimulus that's got a specific image, and then you see a lot of images, and you have to respond to every one of them, but then you have to not respond when you see the target. So it's really training your attention. But we're really interested in, hey, are there modifications of those exercises that might, be designed very specifically so we can train attention around specific things, right? Let's say you are an air traffic control operator. Could we build versions of freeze frame that are really optimized to helping you pay attention to the kinds of things that air traffic control operators need to pay attention to? So those kinds of things are always ongoing, but it does take a while for these new exercises to come out. Thanks for the question, and we always appreciate people who are interested in doing more with BrainHQ. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. For as often as we train with these exercises, I also often forget how much work goes into the exercises behind the scenes. So it's nice to be reminded and sort of relearn all of that information as well. Okay, so I want to start pivoting a little bit to maybe some medical conditions or medical questions, if
Sure.
that's okay. I
Yeah,
know we aren't
absolutely.
medical practitioners, disclaimer here.
Yep.
But we have quite a few people in the audience who are asking, has BrainHQ been shown to help with dementia, pulmonary fibrosis, TBI, so on and so forth? Can you speak to
Yeah,
maybe those
yeah.
sort of
I can speak to
populations?
some general topics, and then if there are specific ones in there, I'm happy to speak to some specifics. I will issue the same disclaimer that you did. I'm a PhD. That means I'm a research doctor in neuroscience. I'm not an MD. So if you have more specific medical questions, you should talk to your doctor. And also important for me to say, hey, BrainHQ is not intended as a medical device to treat any particular medical condition. It's a brain fitness, a brain wellness program to help generally improve brain health and cognitive function. But with that being said, something I think that's been super interesting to me as a researcher in this field over the past 10 years or so is, we built these brain training exercises originally, and we thought a lot about getting older because everyone gets older. And on the average, not everyone, but on the average, we do start to slow down and our memory gets a bit worse. But what happened to us scientifically is that many, many academic researchers and universities all around the country and then eventually all around the world came to us and said, hey, I'm studying cognitive function in all kinds of things. I'm studying cognitive function in schizophrenia. I'm studying cognitive function in traumatic brain injury. I'm studying cognitive function in multiple sclerosis. Hey, can I use the brain training exercises you built in this study that the NIH is funding me to do? And we said yes to just about everyone. That's what we did. That turned out to be an incredibly good decision because, what came back to us year after year after year was studies that were totally independent from us. We didn't design them. We didn't influence how they were built. We didn't influence how they were run, but they came back to us. And for the most part, what they showed us was that, hey, BrainHQ training was, shown to be helpful in a variety of these different cases. And I want to emphasize, again, if you're launching a new drug, you usually have to do early randomized controlled studies to show that there's promise. And then you have to do definitive large-scale randomized controlled trials, typically with several hundred or several thousand people to go to the FDA and show that these products are safe and effective. So the work I'm going to be mentioning here is what I would call that first phase of work, where there are initial studies that showed some promise. I'll speak a little bit more generally, and then if there are specific ones you might mention, you might mention them. I think that where our head about the science of this is that, what BrainHQ helps with is it helps improve information processing in the brain, and it helps improve that neuromodulatory function I talked about, stuff like attention and acetylcholine. Now, when we get older, on the average, we know that what happens is our brain gets kind of noisier, right? It's almost like we're listening to the radio and the dial goes off the signal a little bit and there's some static, which makes it harder to hear and harder to remember and harder to pay attention. And as we get older, we have kind of that static inside our brain information processing. And what the BrainHQ exercises are designed to do through that process of brain plasticity is, hey, get the brain back on the signal, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of different things that can happen to your brain, right? Schizophrenia is really different than traumatic brain injury, and that's really different than multiple sclerosis. But even though the cause of all those things is quite different, it seems to us as scientists that one way or the other, all those brains ending up looking kind of noisy, right? Again, like that radio that's gone off the signal. And maybe what that means is these same kind of training exercises can help many of those brains kind of get back on the signal. And I would say that's what these preliminary studies have generally shown, is that, hey, in a variety of these conditions, people's brains get less noisy, their perceptual abilities improve, and their cognitive abilities improve. Now, in general, we're still waiting for large definitive studies, but hey, if there are specific ones that have come up in the questions, I'm happy to kind of share what we've seen from the initial studies that have been done.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions about dementia, which you had already kind of touched on, concussion.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll say one or two more words
yeah,
about dementia, if I may, because it's such an
sure.
important topic.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to distinguish dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is a very general term that what it means is, hey, a person's brain function has deteriorated to the point where they're having problems with activities of daily living. They can't necessarily look after themselves in their own home, and they need someone to start to take care of them. There's a lot of things that can cause dementia. Alzheimer's disease is a specific kind of dementia where we recognize that it seems to be associated with the buildup of this specific protein that's abnormal in the brain, what are called amyloid plaques. And of course, the primary symptom that then emerges is a memory disorder, because those amyloid plaques first build up in the parts of the brain that relate to memory, although eventually they get all over the brain and people have all kinds of problems. And so a very common question is, hey, does BrainHQ, help with Alzheimer's disease? And what I should say is we now recognize that Alzheimer's disease, it begins very early. A lot of people who have cognitively normal abilities start to have some amyloid building up in their brain. And then what happens is that eventually you have some initial memory complaints, which clinicians called mild cognitive impairment, and then eventually you can't take care of yourself quite as well, and they would call that Alzheimer's disease. So we don't know right now whether BrainHQ training affects amyloid directly. We simply don't know, although it's a research question that many of us would very much like to figure out. But what we do know is, hey, there have been initial small studies done in the early stages in mild cognitive impairment, which have shown, again, in these small initial studies that we can improve cognitive function in mild cognitive impairment. But the area I think that we're most interested in is, can we build better brain health before a person even has mild cognitive impairment, right? Can we take a perfectly normal person who's maybe experiencing a little bit of processing speed or memory issues, have them use BrainHQ and make that brain stronger and more resilient so that 10 years later, well, a person doesn't go on to Alzheimer's disease. And a wonderful research study was published a few years ago showing exactly that. That active study that I mentioned showed that people who did this BrainHQ speed training actually had about a 29% lower risk of going on to dementia 10 years later. And that was a pretty exciting result, because it said, hey, maybe if we build a healthier brain in advance, we can slow down the effects of dementia. That study was considered so promising, actually, that the NIH funded an enormous large replication of that, which is currently going on. So we're looking forward to seeing how that goes. But are there one or two other ones I can speak to? I'll try to be more brief.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I actually wanted to pivot a little bit back to research.
Oh,
Where can people find what research is currently being conducted that's using BrainHQ? That's a question that we often get in CD. And people are also sometimes chomping at the bit to try and participate in those studies. Can you speak a
fantastic.
little bit to that process?
Yeah, wonderful. So, hey, people who are interested in the research studies can go to the BrainHQ website, and maybe you'll show this at the end of our webinar here today. If you click on the section in the BrainHQ website that talks about science, you'll find a section in there that talks about the hundreds of research studies that have been done, and that's a
Yeah, let me
pretty
go ahead and pull it up.
comprehensive. That's a pretty comprehensive list. Yeah, world-class science. And then if you click on the proven benefits of BrainHQ is a summary of it, and then underneath that, so this is a wonderful summary of the research studies that have been done. But if you click on that world-class science again, and you click on hundreds of research studies,
Uh,
there
yes,
you
here we
go.
go.
You'll find, frankly, a comprehensive list of the studies that have been done, and there are usually links if you're able to, interested in reading more about them. So again, more than 200 papers on there is very exciting. As far as participating in research is concerned, that's fantastic. Researchers like me and the team here at Posit Science, hey, we depend upon people putting up their hands up and saying, I want to help scientists. Virtually every research study that uses BrainHQ is being run at an academic medical center because we like to partner with, leading academic scientists to run these studies. And so what I would encourage you to do is to reach out to the university hospital that's closest to you and say, hey, I'm interested in participating in a research study. And hey, maybe you're a healthy person that they would be wonderful to be in a research study as someone to compare a person with a brain health issue. Maybe you have a brain health issue yourself and joining a research study, whether it's a BrainHQ study, but might also be a drug study or a device study or a behavioral study. There are always interesting research studies going on in all kinds of clinical conditions. And again, I encourage people to reach out to their local university or their local academic medical center, because that's just a wonderful gift that you can give to the field of science, is to join something like this and participate in it in this way. So, wonderful question.
All right, and I think we have so many questions, but we are coming up on the top of the hour, and I do want to, be respectful of everybody's time. So I think I actually want to start wrapping it up here, if that's all right.
Okay.
All right. So I wanted to thank everybody in the audience again for participating, and for everybody that submitted a question. Thank you so, so much. Wonderful discussion and great review of answers from Henry for sure. Kind of gave you a little bit of a talking marathon today, Henry. So thanks for being here, and thank you for doing all
Well,
that.
I know we didn't answer them all, so if I didn't get to your question and you would really like us to take a look at it, go ahead and email us at support@brainhq.com over the next couple of days. I will look through them and follow up on any additional ones that people have. Thanks for all the interest. I think, Stephanie, we wondered whether this was going to be a little bit of a dry and excessively scientific topic, but there was a tremendous amount of interest. So that's really thrilling to me as a member of the science team and a person here at BrainHQ. So reach out if we can help. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Took the words right out of my mouth. Go ahead and email us support@brainhq.com if you have any questions that you really want answered that we didn't get an opportunity to answer today. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded, and I will send everybody a link to the recording when it's on our YouTube channel sometime next week. You'll get a follow-up email from me if you're registered. If you want to know right when that video goes live, you can go to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe to our channel there to get a notification when that video is up. Next month, we have a BrainHQ Academy webinar that Henry I believe, is also going to be running about the different facets of memory. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into memory. And then the following month in January, we are back at the top of the year, and we're going to be talking about setting training goals and setting up your schedule for training within BrainHQ. So look out for email invitations for those. Henry, do you have any final takeaways that you want to share with our audience today?
No, thanks for all the great questions. It is really wonderful to be talking with people who care so much about getting the science right and building brain training programs that work. So with that, happy brain training, folks. Thanks.
Happy brain training.